Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar from Analytical Factory. This morning, we're looking at revealing emotion insights of tone of voice analysis using the Phoebe platform. And for those of you that haven't joined any of these sessions before, you just need to bear in mind that all the lines are muted, so we can't hear you. And we are recording today's session. So you'll receive a link to download the slides, a PDF of slides, and to watch the recording later on today or to share with colleagues. Questions can be submitted using the Q&A panel, and we'll field these as we're going along if we can. But we often just follow up afterwards once we've had a chance to get through the session and read the questions. My colleague, Rachel Clinton, is also online, and she'll be fielding and checking those questions as we're going along, so they're not being ignored. My name's Jarlath Quinn. I'm one of the technical consultants here at Analytical Factory. And the Phoebe portal is a platform that we've been working with for the past few years. Analytical Factory are a relatively small organization founded by 4 veterans of the data science, analytics, data science, and research technology industries, strong background in the software around these industries, stretching back 20 to 30 years. And the aim is to deliver voice-enabled technology solutions to research and to other sectors. And we work very closely with the developers of Phoebe, who are former colleagues of ours and who we deal with pretty much on an almost daily basis these days, as we're fielding questions from users and helping them develop the product to meet existing users' needs and the future direction. So Phoebe's been generating quite a lot of interest of late across a number of different sectors, but particularly within market research, it has to be said. There is a slant towards that, but that's mostly because early adopters of that technology have worked within market research. We are seeing other sectors starting to take an interest now, particularly in things like call center management and in forms of non-commercial research. So the raison d'etre for Phoebe is that voice is still the most intuitive and natural and efficient way for most people to communicate. Phoebe offers multiple ways to capture and send voice data to its own cloud-based analysis platform. Currently, Phoebe offers 3 different methods for doing so. One is Phoebe plugin, which is a way to voice enable pretty much any web-based survey or any web-based page, really. The second one is Phoebe Live, where spoken responses are transcribed and analyzed in real time on Phoebe's analysis platform. And the third section is self-service upload, where people already have digital data. They already have recordings of Zoom meetings. Perhaps they've got focus groups. Perhaps they've got in-depth interviews. Perhaps they've got people who've sent in responses or evaluations of products, and the researchers asked them to record it on the phone. Maybe call center monitoring. It might be stuff that they've actually harvested off social media. So we've got a lot of people harvesting data off YouTube and TikTok. And the data itself could take the form of pretty much any form of audio, MP3, M4A, through to video, in which case they can simply upload all of that data in one go on their own. It's pretty simple to do so, and I'll show you a quick demonstration of that later on. Phoebe plugin is doing a similar thing, of course. It's just allowing people to voice their responses rather than typing in the responses, usually to open-ended questions in surveys. And I'll be showing a recording of that in action in just a few moments. Okay, so in survey research, Phoebe plugin offers respondents the opportunity to record their answers rather than type them in. And these days, that's a particularly popular option among a lot of respondents and researchers, particularly because people are using increasingly smartphones to complete surveys. And when it comes to open-ended questions in particular, where people are asked their opinions or to give feedback in a more generic fashion, in a qualitative way, if you like, they tend to either skip those questions very often because they're just too much effort to try and type in a response, or they give very, very short responses, so they don't tend to have a lot of detail. Our own research indicates that Depending on age group, younger people are more likely to take this option, and depending on the method in which they're responding by, people using people using smartphones are more likely to take this option. About half of people choose to voice enable their responses, and when they do so, of course, it means that they can give a response usually quicker than typing, so they can talk at a relaxed pace. And that means that their responses tend to be longer and richer and packed with more detail. But it also means that the recording of their responses, the actual voice recording, can be sent to the Phoebe platform, where we can listen to it, and we can check and make sure that we understand that the transcriptions work correctly. If there's something that's been mentioned in there, it's garbled and they can't hear what it is, they can often listen to the recording. But lastly, Phoebe actually performs a analysis of tone of voice. So it listens to the recording and analyzes the recording to conduct an analysis on the tone of voice, classifying that voice tone into 5 different emotion categories, which again can be very powerful and very useful for researchers who are trying to understand how people are talking about particular topics rather than just what words they're using. So this is a typical example. This is me using a Phoebe plugin. I think it was Qualtrics. It was a while back, and you'll see that when I click this, I'm just filling out a survey here. The first question doesn't need to be voice enabled, so it's just a quantitative question. I'm just clicking next. The next question, because I'm using a phone, asks me to enable.
What did you like most about the voice research?
The question's read out. I thought it was a really interesting conference of lots of opportunities for networking. Well, that is transcribed and it automatically jumps to the next question.
What did you like least about the voice research?
The venue could have been better. It was difficult to find and it took a long time to gain access.
What would be the most valuable experience we could facilitate at the voice research next time? Please list as many ideas as you'd like.
I'd like to have more time to talk to some of the speakers, as well as the opportunity to play with some of the software tools.
Is there anything else you would like to share with us?
Not at this time. So once that's completed, those sets of responses are completed, of course, the responses themselves and the transcribed responses themselves are going to go to the survey platform, in this case, Qualtrics. But they are also sent in tandem to the Phoebe plugin platform, where one could listen to the recordings themselves, also see the transcriptions, maybe alter the transcriptions and clean them up a little bit, and perform voice analysis on that. Now, the Phoebe plugin is fully configurable. We've made it easy for people to configure it themselves. So things like, for example, having the question read out, you may not necessarily want that. You might not want it to automatically jump to the next question. You might want to give them time to think about it. You might give them the option to re-record their answers. So there's various things that one can do. If you click on the Phoebe plugin configuration here, you can see that there's a number of different platforms that are currently supported already out of the box. You can see the type of audio that you can upload here. You can see minimum answer length, maximum answer length, that type of thing. If there are always new platforms, of course, coming to our attention, many research agencies are developing their own data capture platforms, in which case we simply author a plugin or author a script, which looks kind of like this at the bottom here, which we would add to their as a line of code to the HTML of their platform to voice enable the questions that they wanted to voice enable. And then we could reuse that script on an ongoing basis if they wanted to come back and do more research for us. So that's Phoebe plugin. That's a little example. And all that's doing, of course, is it's capturing data, transcribing data, and sending that data to both the survey platform and to the Phoebe portal platform, Phoebe's own cloud-based platform itself. And that, when we get onto the subject of Phoebe portal, as we're talking about, here we're talking about where these responses actually end up, what the transcriptions look like, and how we listen to them. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, one of the things that Phoebe does, of course, is it analyzes the tone of voice. And in that case, what it's trying to do here is not so much text-based sentiment analysis in the way that people have traditionally done via text mining, in which myself and many of my colleagues have done for many years in our other roles as data scientists, but rather it's listening to how people speak. So Phoebe isn't listening to the words at all. It's simply listening to tone of voice. And the difference between what people say and how people say certain things is of interest to a lot of researchers, and certainly we find that to be a very powerful discriminator between different respondents, between different respondent groups, and between their attitudes and understanding and evaluation of products, for example. And now the research behind the tone of voice analysis is pretty extensive. I mean, within a few, if you went on to Google, within a few clicks, and if you wanted to search around and look at the history of research in human vocal emotion analysis, you'll find that there's actually a lot of papers. This was just about 3 minutes of me searching around, and it turns out that the history of vocal research, research into what you call vocal prosody, stretches back quite a long way. So, for example, one of the things that's became quite influential in the 1980s that Fanagy found that vocal expression of basic human emotions tends to be similar in many languages. So there's a lot of analysis of, you know, how this changes, or how emotions like happiness or sadness or excitement or anxiety are expressed across different cultures. One of the fundamental papers that certainly underpins a lot of the approach that Phoebe takes was from 1993, Murray and Arnold, which looked at pitch, range, and shape and timing of words used to classify different emotions. This spawned a number of different applications in different fields. So it's a very, very influential paper. But since that, as you can see from the previous screenshots I've shown, there's actually been a lot of other research in that area. Now, if you want to understand how this works, it's basically a machine learning application, something that we're used to within our previous careers and other jobs that we work within, dealing with machine learning against standard quantitative data. Here, of course, we're dealing with audio data, but data is data. It has an input. It has a number of features that can be extracted from it. Those features can then be selected or evaluated in terms of their ability to classify or predict an outcome. And then the outcome itself, the classification, the category, the confidence scores associated with that can be then used to create an emotion class. If you're familiar with things like recursive neural networks or Markov chains, this is a very similar approach to this, where it's applying these machine learning techniques on a regular basis and on a time basis. So as it hears an audio signal, it's constantly classifying as it's going along. And in the case of Phoebe, I think it's doing this every 3 seconds. If you're familiar with something like cluster analysis, if you've done anything like segmentation, then the output classes are very similar to clusters. Hence the fact that they can somewhat overlap with one another. So you can have somebody who is, 70% strong in their response, and 20%, happy, and 10% calm in terms of response. So there is an overlap between these categorizations. In fact, the features that it's extracting, the principal features it's extracting in the Murray and Arnold paper were things like speech rate, whether or not people are speaking faster, their pitch average, that's literally the kilohertz that they're speaking at, the pitch range, so the standard deviation, if you like, of the pitch, the intensity, which is a measure of volume, and whether or not it's higher or lower intensity, voice quality in terms of breathiness, pitch changes, whether or not they're abrupt, and articulation, which is the sharpness of the articulation of the different consonants and syllables that people are speaking. And in the case of Murray and Arnold, strong, which usually represents passionate or emphatic emotional responses, declamatory, happiness, which tends to be associated with upbeat or optimistic, sad, which tends to be associated with changes in pitch, which are going downwards, rather lower pitch, downward inflections, tend to be reflective or even nostalgic or considerate, generally more downbeat. Anxiety tends to be fear, tends to be nervousness, tends to be hesitation, tends to be concern, It's one of the harder ones to kind of classify. And calmness is one of the easier ones, which is simply, you know, when people are speaking in a very even, relatively calm way, with the same values constant throughout their sentences and their responses. One of the examples of a tick in a piece of speech is an audio BBC interview. What we've noticed over the years when we've been working with Phoebe is that when people are actually asked to speak about an emotion, if they're asked to speak about anxiety, it's interesting that they actually become more anxious. We can show some examples of that. When they're asked to speak about a really sad event, they actually become sadder. So it's not terribly surprising that in an interview of a woman diagnosed with anxiety, as she speaks, it is classifying in real time. It's saying that this person's vocal profile, if you like, is closest to the anxious state, the anxious cluster, if you like. And what it's doing, of course, is extracting things like the words themselves, the syllables between the words, and it's analyzing the gaps between the syllables and the words and saying how small they are and whether or not they're getting smaller over time as they start to speak faster, or whether or not they're becoming more hesitant and these gaps are getting longer. It's looking at the pitch range in terms of the actual kilohertz, the pitch, whether or not their voice is going up and down, and whether or not that's even, or whether or not it's changing abruptly. And it's looking at loudness and intensity. And from, for example, just those three factors, you could probably extract a number of different factors. You've got the variation in it, you've got the change from 1 second to the next, you've got the mean, the average, etc., etc. So as is typical of many data science applications, you can generate an awful lot of measures. In the case of Phoebe, it generates 24 separate measures in order to classify or cluster people into their respective emotional states as they're speaking. So as an example of that, we when we first started down this route, we had limitations with regard to what data we could show people in demonstration purposes, because all the data we had, of course, was confidential. The data for Phoebe is stored in the EU. It's stored in within a highly secured ISO compliant online cloud environment. So it's entirely and encrypted, of course. It's very secure. In the US, we also have a separate storage facility for that. Here we have a survey of family and friends. I think, again, we use Qualtrics for this particular survey platform. We just asked them 3 questions, and we sent out a little survey to them on WhatsApp, asking 3 questions, and we picked a topic which we felt was fairly emotive, that everybody has an opinion about. Usually most people have a story about, and that topic is food. And what we were interested in was, what was your absolute favorite memory of food or confectionery growing up, and why was that special? What was the worst thing you've ever eaten or cooked, and how did that happen? And if you walked into the restaurant of your dreams, what would you order and why? And we were really interested in situations where the words and the sentiment of the words contradicted the tone of voice, where people were really talking about maybe something that's really disgusting or quite disturbing to them, perhaps when they were a child, but where the tone of voice is actually much more upbeat about it. So we could demonstrate how vocal sentiment is not the same as spoken sentiment, is not the same as written or word sentiment. Topics which would elicit the most passionate responses, which ones give us strong scores? Strong is a fairly straightforward dimension. If you think about it, if Phoebe just measured strength, that would be useful in and of itself. When people get louder, when people get more emphatic, when they get more passionate, when they speak more quickly, for example. That's a fairly easy dimension to measure and fairly objective. And we're also interested in childhood memories of feelings of disgust and delight, and how they would manifest themselves as emotional categories, given the fact that we don't have a category called disgust that we can measure. So we look at the responses of that. If I jump out to the Phoebe portal platform here, and we'll find the food heaven versus food hell project in here, and I'll talk about how we can add records to this project as we're going along, and how we can set up our own projects. We've got a number of different projects here, test projects and stuff that we've gathered over the years. Look at the food heaven, food hell project. It's got 58 responses in it. We can see the transcriptions here. So if I click on, I can see the actual transcriptions of an individual response and what question that was. You know, what was the rest? In this case, what was the restaurant of your dreams? And we've got a number of different responses. To make it easier for me, I've actually added in what are called, these look like filter variables, but we call them tags. And there are lots of different ways in which you can tag data up. A tag could be whether or not they're male or female. It could be the question that they're answering. It could be, the territory they belong to, what language they're speaking. And it means we can isolate and filter on that. But a tag could also refer to the topics that they're speaking about, in which case it's what's happening inside the text. And there are lots of different ways in which we can do that. We can search for certain words and create tag groups from it. We can manually select groups and create tag groups for that, or we can ask it to perform a sort of NLP, a natural language processing algorithm, where it will read the text and pull out terms like nouns and adjectives and stuff like that, which will allow us then to create tags from that. So lots of different ways in which we create tags. And I would say that for most people, when they're starting out in a project, they'll often ask us to help them on that first project. We'll usually charge them a day's worth of consultancy to work on their first project, but they don't have to. They can, if they're feeling confident about it. They can play around with it themselves. But it's usually tagging that we're doing. We're usually just cleaning things up and creating interesting tag groups for them. So I've got a tag group here just called demo or standard. And if I click on demo, it just isolates the stuff that I use for demonstration purposes. And the first thing I want to demonstrate is a response where the vocal sentiment isn't the same as the written sentiment or the word sentiment. And here we can see the oysters, I just hate the sensation of that thing going down my throat, is the response to the question, what's the worst thing you've ever eaten? And interestingly enough, that's obviously an incredibly negative sentiment. I just hate the sensation of that thing. It's a very negative sentiment. It's loathing. And yet the overall response, and it's only 8 seconds, which means that Phoebe has 2 attempts, 2 chances to apply its algorithm, because it only does it every 3 seconds. Its overall response is happiness, with some strength in there, some strong. And if we actually highlight bits of the text, I can click on this first bit here. You can see this belongs to the first 3 seconds. That's where the strength is. And that's because, and you can hear why that is the case. Whereas the rest of it, if I highlight that, you can see that's where the happiness is. So it's very upbeat. And we can hear exactly why that is the case if we listen to the response, where the respondent, Alex, speaks.
Oysters. I just hate the sensation of that thing going down my throat.
So she doesn't say oysters. She says
oysters.
She says oysters. She's very emphatic about it. She's very strong on it. And then, of course, you can tell why she's happy, because she starts laughing about it.
I just hate the sensation of that thing going down my throat.
Turns out we can listen to these things in real time. So let's look at another example from Alex. This time, this is the exact opposite situation, where she's actually talking about a really happy memory, but where it's classifying a lot of it as sad. Now, this was collected during the pandemic, of course. A lot of people, she's from Brazil, and a lot of people hadn't been home for a while. She's talking about a really happy memory here. It's classifying it as sad. Sad is the closest cluster group or category to which her tone of voice profile for that section belongs. So you can see it actually starts off here. She's pretty calm. And then she's very happy when she starts talking off about it, and it gets sadder. And again, if I play it back in real time, you can see why.
Warm hot chocolate on rainy days. Because always when it was raining a lot in my childhood, my mom would make warm cakes for us, and I love it, and I try to make it for my kids too nowadays when it's raining.
So you can hear
warm cakes for us.
Her tone of voice dropping there. You can hear the words getting slightly further apart. She picks away through the sentence. The closest group to that, the closest classification to that group is sad.
And I love it, and I try to make it for my kids too nowadays when it's raining.
Does that mean she's actually sad? Well, no. She's clearly wistful here. She's clearly she's nostalgic. So context is really important when we're making an interpretation of this, in exactly the same way that if we were doing a cluster analysis and we created cluster group 1, 2, 3, 4, we have to give those clusters names, and we have to describe what's happening in those clusters. In this case, we're using some arbitrary labeling beforehand: happy, strong, anxious, sad, and we make a judgment on that. Here's an example of somebody speaking. Again, it highlights how accents can be High accents can be captured very well. These people are speaking on phones, by the way. Phone microphones are really good, so they're really clear. If they're speaking on laptops with a lot of background noise, Phoebe can still work pretty well, but the quality of the audio classification tends to suffer somewhat. It's something to bear in mind.
Okay, so the restaurant of my dreams is pretty much up and down the high street. It's not of dreams. It's not some big fancy restaurant or doing cordon bleu food or anything like that. My husband and I have this chat about what would you have as your death row meal, your last meal that you could have, and mine's is always sandwiches. I think sandwiches are delicious. I love them. I love them in every shape and form. Bread is like my number one enemy and I try and avoid it, but I absolutely love sandwiches. I like food that you could pick at, whether it be like olives and salami and nice cheeses and grapes and stuff. But just a lovely selection of sandwiches would be my absolute favourite meal.
That's a very strong response there. You can actually see that at the start she's nervous, or it sounds like she's anxious, but it's because there is tension. You can actually hear that there is kind of tension because she's saying, right, so the restaurant of my dreams is, it's not up and down the high street. It's not cordon bleu. There's a bit of tension there, and then she relaxes. She starts to talk about sandwiches. Here's another example. The same person, not the same person speaking, but we've got a person here speaking about the worst thing that they've eaten when they were growing up, and we were interested in how disgust would manifest itself. We find that in the responses, disgust tended to be associated with strong and anxious combinations. So you can hear this.
The worst thing I've ever eaten was actually my mum's pork mince. It was boiled to within an inch of its life. It was bland. It was wet. It was just soggy mince, and it was a poor thing to serve. That was the worst thing I've ever had.
Compare and contrast that same respondent talking about their favorite food growing up.
When growing up, my favourite food was the Findus crispy pancakes, and the reason was because it was the only thing that my mum didn't crucify.
Notice that when he says it's the only thing my mum didn't crucify, it's coming out as anxious, and then he gets back to the topic.
Everything else she used to ruin, but those, she used to sort them out good and proper. And as a hungry lad, used to wolf down loads of them. Loved it.
Okay, so you get the idea. The thing to bear in mind here is that these are transcriptions. I mean, you will get errors in transcriptions. I've deliberately left one in here where we said the restaurant of my dreams. The person here speaking says, we have this chat about. Well, you can edit that, of course. You can edit that. She actually says chat out here, but you can edit that. So you'd expect to have to go through and edit it occasionally. This could, of course, be in another language, in which case you'd get a little translation button here. You could click on it and you'd switch back and forth between the English language spoken and whatever that language it has been translated from, and so you'd be able to see the transcription in both cases. The tags here, the tag groups that we created here, you can see are just ones I've created which relate to the question that's being asked and whether it's a demo or not. But I could actually create other tags. I can actually run this procedure here called discovery, and discovery goes and analyzes the data, and it pulls out the terms and words that people are speaking in terms of their grammar, in terms of the actual type of word they're using, whether it's an adjective or noun. So if you look at like adjectives only here, you see favorite, bad, good, big, special, and if I add in nouns and say add that in, that's usually what I use in order to create tags from that. It's very interesting. People will often use words like thing if they're English language speakers. They say, well, the thing is, and the thing about this and thing. So terms like, if I was looking at cherry picking through this, I'd be looking at stuff like, individual food types like fish, cheese, it gets mentioned. I might be creating a food type, chocolate getting mentioned. There's fish again coming up. Or you're seeing memories of school. You see a lot of stuff around childhood and around families and stuff like that. So I might be going through this and saying, oh, that's quite useful. I wouldn't have thought about that. I'll cherry pick these and I'll pick things like childhood. I'll pick things like mentions of mum or dad or something like that. Alternatively, I could search for these terms and say, okay, I want to search for, mum or something like that. And it would go off and find everyone. I could create tags from that group or look for a term like school or childhood or something like that, and say, okay, look for anything childhood or children, because it's not an exact match at this stage, and say child, that finds all those childhood, cherry pick that. And when I create these tag groups, they end up here in this tag management system. So I could look at something like family here and say family only. And here you can see I've got a type group called family, and I've got dad, grandparent, mom, family, mom, dad, and every time that's been mentioned. And that means that I can now isolate when people are talking about those topics, whether it be the sentence or the word or the paragraph that's being mentioned. And then it means that I can then go off and create little charts and say, well, look, when you're looking at family, what is the emotion profile? What's the average emotion profile associated with that? So people, when they're talking about their parents, they tend to be very calm, maybe quite sort of reflective. Family does actually tend to elicit quite strong responses. We're really interested in, one of the things we're interested in is what topics elicit the strongest responses. Grandparents, very warm responses, and oddly enough, mom and dad tend to elicit a lot of anxiety when people are talking about their mom and dad and they're growing up, especially when they're talking about their mom and dad's cooking and they're growing up. So you get the idea there. Let's jump out to a different example here. This is a more professional example. That's one obviously that we've collected for our own purposes to demonstrate the concept of it. But here we have a Dynata survey. This is actually a real survey here of US and UK respondents. It was around the pharmaceutical industry. And people were being asked questions about, what do you think the worst thing that the pharmaceutical industry does? What do you think the best thing that it does? And give me an example of a really peak emotion. I did say when people are talking about an emotion, they actually tend to mirror that emotion. They tend to emote it. So here's a perfect example of that. You can see I've actually tagged this person's entire response there as talking about family, because that's what I've asked it to do. I've asked it to say, the entire paragraph. If it mentions family, I want to know how they talk about that. But it could just be the word. But you listen to this person, you can see him getting more, you can hear him get more anxious as he's speaking, and you can hear why, because his breathiness, he almost sounds like he's short of breath.
I was at work, and it was really extremely fast-paced. Everybody kept coming at us from more and more to-do items and do it now and deadlines. There's just so much going on and not enough resources. Our team is so small. It just causes my heart rate to go up, and I can feel my body tensing up. I just push through it because it's the rat race and we all have to do it.
You get the idea. Again, with this was a really interesting project because it was incredibly emotive. People were being asked about their own attitude to pharmaceutical companies, about the treatment that they were on, about illness in their family, about their own illnesses. And it was really interesting because if you search for certain terms, like I searched for the word cure here, I searched for cure. You'd think that would be associated with lots of, very upbeat people talking about. After all, people are talking about cures, but it's quite counterintuitive because actually they get quite anxious about it. And you can listen to some of these responses. You can hear why. Again, let's listen to this one.
I really can't think of any good thing that they do because they're in it for profit. I still think that they've got cancer cured, and they just won't release the drug.
So you get a lot of people talking about money and about when they're talking about pharmaceuticals and about the business of pharmaceuticals. So I created a tag group here, for example, that I just called business. You see there's one here called drugs when people are mentioning, opioids, addiction, generic drugs, that type of stuff. I've clicked one here called business, and business is made up of terms like money, company, profit. So I might be, if people talking about money, if they're talking about dollars or something, I might group them together into the same value. So I'm reconciling it in some way, affordability, etc. And when I look at the emotion profile against that, it's, there's a lot of strong feelings here around company, profits, affordability, price, insurance, and expense, as opposed to, say, something around different types of drugs, where we're saying generics tend to have a lot of strong, because a lot of them are using the generic drugs, but addiction, a lot of sadness. Insulin tends to be a real hot topic because a lot of these are US customers, and the price of insulin's gone through the roof. Or opioid addiction, of course, related to addiction, that tends to elicit a lot of sadness. So again, very, very interesting. It allows us then to isolate certain topics. So typical things that we would be doing is that you know, if we were doing an analysis where people are evaluating a product or something like that, it might be, we're looking at different aspects of the product. We're talking about the scent, if it's a type of personal care product. When people are mentioning the scent, how are they talking about it? If they've got two products that are being mentioned, maybe we've got product A and product B here. When they talk about the scent, how do they talk about it? When they talk about the ease of use of a product, how do they talk about it? When they talk about the expense of the product, they talk about the aesthetics of it. We can create these tag groups and then compare one group against another, how men talk about it rather than women talk about it, in exactly the same way as we would with any analysis. It turns out actually that we don't have to use these little charts here. We can actually take these charts and we can actually, there's other types of charts here, like for example, data facts here, where we can see where they're, when they're above or below average here on, are they more strong? Are they more passionate when they're talking about health or terms like mental or pharmaceutical? And we can actually download and extract the data from that. So I would commonly extract the data. You can see the individual scores here: strong, happy. You can see these are the actual final scores that are creating those charts. And I might, for example, create my own charts from that. So let's see if I got one here. I've got one. Let's have a look at Charts Excel. There we go. So you get an example here. Here's some charts from the Dynata data: health, treatment, mental cure. I'm traffic lighting it here. I'm changing the labels from happy and sad to upbeat and downbeat. I'm doing radar charts of the same data. I'm doing scatter plots where I'm looking at 2 dimensions, where I'm looking at strong against anxiety and which ones load highest on that. Interesting enough, cure tends to load highest enough on that. And there's even things called emotional response scores, which are just basically averages. They're kind of average scores, where we can say the minimum maximum is and what the average is when people are talking about particular topics. Phoebe creates these for us as well. And there's a little formula that you can change. You can change and alter the formula, how that's calculated if you don't like it. But it's an ERS scorecard here. So it's when you have lots and lots of terms that are used and you're just kind of interested in which ones tend to be associated with the more negative, anxiety and sadness, as opposed to upbeat and calm scores, to get a kind of overall average, if you like, of the vocal sentiment. Okay, I've only got 20 minutes left, so I'm just going to point out a bunch of other things you can do. I did mention that with this particular project, and we've got a lot of projects in there, that particular project, we were gathering data from Phoebe plugin. What happens if you got your own data that you've already collected? Well, it might be interview-based data, it might be qualitative data. If I want to add my own files, upload my own files onto a Phoebe project, I can click on here and I can either create a new project name, or I can point to an existing project. I've got one here. I'm just going to close this one. This is Desert Island Discs. So I've just taken some recordings of Desert Island Discs of the Radio 4 player and just used them as an example. If I wanted to pick the latest episode of that, I could click choose files at this point. I could point to, in this case, happened to be Simon Pegg. It wasn't the latest episode, but there was one recently. And you can see the number of languages that are supported here. By default, it's defaulting to English language. But each individual file that we upload here, we can cherry pick what is the language that they're speaking in. And you can see that there's, at the end of this presentation, you'll see a table of languages. It's nothing like up to date enough, because as you can see here, there's a huge range of different language packs here, including things like Yiddish and Edo and different forms of Russian and different Swiss French, for example, as opposed to Cameroonian French, etc., etc. And you can choose those different language packs. If I wanted to add this to it and say, okay, create that point, it would say, okay, at this stage, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to transcribe it? Do you want me to identify the different speakers within it? Because, of course, there's an interviewer and a speaker. Do you want me to do the emotion detection? Do you need me to translate to English? And it would give me a dollar price associated with that. People can buy credits for Phoebe projects on a project by project basis, or they can just bank a load of credits and then draw down on them. And we can give more information about pricing on that if you get in contact with us. But that's how it works. And then I could click process. In this case, I'm not going to process it. So when I go to the data set on that, you can see it's kind of half uploaded it, and I can just delete it because it's already there. And if I look inside the previously uploaded Simon Pegg dataset, You can see that I've got some diarization here. I can click on speakers, and you can see this just said speaker 1 and speaker 0 here, but I've actually identified Simon Pegg as speaker 1 and speaker 0 as Lauren Laverne. And I've indicated that she is the interviewer. And the reason why I'm doing that is because you can see she has an emotional tone of voice scores as well. But by identifying her as the interviewer, it means that that's not included in my charting. It's not included in my analysis. So it basically nullifies, or she becomes a missing value. You can also see that the interviewers appear in italics, and I can download a transcript of the interview. So I can say, okay, show me a PDF of that. Here's a transcript of the interview. What was the relationship with your dad like? It was good, blah, blah, blah. And we can do stuff like we can overlay the emotions. I'm talking about his dad here. We can see we can actually see the intensity, whether or not they're speaking louder and where they're speaking louder or quieter. And when you download you overlay the emotions, you can also download that as a PDF of the emotion overlaid on it. So it's a very nice way to get a formatted transcript out of what the interview is and what the person is, etc., etc. Another thing we can do within Phoebe I find useful is to try and do some sort of experimental type work. To kind of some of this is just sort of a curious work that I was very interested in the differences when you have two different types of outcome. So I have one situation here which I chose, which was really interesting, where I took I was searching around on the internet thinking, what could I do as a test? And I found lots of interviews of football managers, not particularly interested in football, but I found lots of interviews of football managers. And of course, they all have post-match interviews, and sometimes they've won and sometimes they've lost. So I've just created a tag variable here saying whether or not they won or lost. And you can click on these responses, if you like, and you can click on these individual transcriptions, and you can listen to the interviewer saying,
first, your team's performance and perhaps how that game started to get away from you.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is that we gave away too many easy goals.
So usually in these interviews, the very first thing they're being asked, well, every single time, is how do you think that went? And if you didn't understand English, and you didn't understand what they're saying, sometimes it'd be quite hard to tell whether or not they won or lost. It strikes me, because they're all media trained, and when they've lost, they want to get off the subject pretty quickly, and when they've won, they tend to be quite philosophical about it. So it doesn't sound like when they've won that they're necessarily that much happier. They do sound a bit more excited, though. So I decided to create this variable here, what the outcome was, whether or not they won or lost, and to compare and contrast that across the entire interview. And what I found was, when I looked across the entire interview, there wasn't a massive difference. Certainly in terms of happiness, they weren't different. But when they won, they tended to be a bit more emphatic, a bit more upbeat, rather than when they were defeated. And that didn't sound fantastic. It didn't sound like a massive slam dunk difference. But then when I listened to the interviews themselves, I discovered that, if they've been defeated, they generally want to get off the subject pretty quickly and want to talk about next week. So it doesn't make sense to look at the entire response. What you should be doing is you should be tagging the very first thing they say in response to the question.
I think you could see the celebrations of everyone. Yeah, it is. You've got to make them.
That's the very first words. So I've tagged the very first words. And then if I do a chart on that, the difference is much more marked. So you can see strong here is coming out as 0.26. Defeat here is coming out as less than half of that. Basically, when they win, they're very, it's like the adrenaline is still there. They speak faster, they speak louder, they're more emphatic. When they're defeated, they're calmer, they're just a lot flatter. There's a bit more anxiety. There's a bit more sadness, but really it's the absence of passion which shows through. In a similar vein, I wanted to demonstrate the fact that lots of people are working with video as well in Phoebe. Phoebe ignores video, but for a lot of customers and a lot of clients, they really like to see video, like to see the people speaking. So increasingly these days, we're dealing with projects where people have uploaded videos as well. So I've got I took some videos here of a person, again, doing a sort of blind test, if you like. This person here is called doing the cheese, testing cheese. And basically, she does a taste test. She does taste tests. And she tries to guess what is the expensive cheese. And then at the end, it's revealed whether that was the expensive cheese. Cheese A was the expensive cheese or the cheap cheese. And I thought, I wonder if there's a difference in the tone of voice when she's describing it. So you can listen to this one as we play it. Let's see.
Let's see. This is like classic blue cheese dressing. I need a wedge salad. This is a really good kind of standard American style blue cheese. This one, and you can see it's creamier. It doesn't fall apart in the same way. It has this really strong fruity smell. It's just not all about salt and spice the way that typical blue cheese flavor is. So that's kind of confirming my suspicions about cheese B.
Okay, so then we look at the responses and we split them into whether or not she was talking about A or talking about B, whether it was the expensive or the cheap version. And what we discover is when we look at the answer here, the response to it, is that when she's talking about the expensive one, she's just a lot calmer. She's kind of usually confirmed her suspicions, and she's gone, yeah, that's right. Yeah, as I thought, that's the expensive one. She's not cock a hoop. She's not punching the air. She tends to be a bit more emphatic in that. But you can see when she's talking about the cheap cheese, she's just a bit more hesitant. She's a bit more anxious associated with that, a bit more unsure, which is how anxiety tends to express itself. So again, a really interesting way, and Phoebe loves tests like that. It loves a sort of A/B test like that, where you've got one test against another. Okay, so coming up to 10 minutes to the hour. That's pretty much all we've got to show with regard to the demonstration of the various capabilities of Phoebe and how people are working with it. Let's just return to the slides here and follow up here. How are our clients making use of the Phoebe portal? Well, they're comparing reactions to products and promotions across different groups. Sometimes these are people who multiple speakers who are actually evaluating products in a focus group. That usually takes a bit more work because you've got multiple speakers and you need to diarize them and identify who's speaking each time, so you can split them up, and you need to identify what projects or what products they're talking about. But when it's just, I want you to evaluate product A, and now I want you to evaluate product B, that's pretty straightforward because you're going to get two different, clear responses from that. So comparing product A to product B is a common application that we have. Another one is analyzing in-depth interviews of multiple speakers, as I said. You've got in-depth interviews, multiple speakers. Creating sizzle reels. I didn't point out the fact that there is a little video editor in there. It's kind of a basic video editor. So you could search in the video editor for tags when people are talking about this particular type of drug. Something else I should point out is that as people are often dealing with quite technical terms, maybe if they're dealing with drugs. So we've added in a keywords list. So that means if you've got a list of, for example, technical terms or product terms, which the Phoebe transcriber might not necessarily understand or may not have it in its library or might not be able to predict, you can add in a list of just technical terms, just a whole list of them, just copy and paste them in. And if it sees a word that sounds like one of those terms, like the name of a drug or something like that, it will use that in the transcription. So it means that the transcriptions are a lot cleaner. So you could then search for that term, that particular use of drug or something like that, and it would find all the video clips associated with that. And you could create what's called a little sizzle reel from that and say, when you're telling the story and explaining how Phoebe works, you could say, well, okay, here's some examples of actual people talking about that, and you could see their emotion state as they're speaking about those particular issues going along. And you can also, of course, export the data out into third-party tools, so you can create your own summary reports and charts using project-specific filters and selections. As I said, there's a number of different languages which are supported by Phoebe. This is just a list of them. Currently, everything can be translated to English, though and everything can be transcribed. Though we are in future releases looking to do a multi-way translation, so translation from Spanish to French or German to Dutch or something like that, depending on people's requirements in that area. And also, so Phoebe Portal, really, if you're trying to get your head around what it does, well, it transcribes, analyzes uploaded audio data from survey responses, interviews and focus groups of multiple speakers in multiple languages. It supports translation of transcribed audio to English, That means the transcription gets translated to English, not necessarily the audio, and is supported from many languages. And the audio can be in almost any format, even extracted from video recordings. I did mention Phoebe Live. We are finding a lot more traction with Phoebe Live. Phoebe Live is a very particular product which delivers real-time emotional intelligence. It's doing exactly the same thing that we've seen already. It's just doing it in real time. So it's kind of using kind of dialer technology. And people are interested in that, particularly in interview situations where they want to ask smarter questions about an interviewee based on their observed emotional state, or they want to identify opportunities to improve empathy, perhaps when they're dealing with salespeople, or generate new data and predict outcomes more accurately, or monitor call center activity in order to intervene as needed. So that's the Phoebe platform for you: Phoebe plugin, Phoebe portal, and Phoebe Live. And we have our own website associated with this. We have some already existing videos that you can have a little look at. But if you wanted to share a recording of this particular webinar with friends and colleagues, please feel free to do so. In the meantime, we thank you very much for logging in, and we look forward to hearing from you again in the near future. Thanks very much.